Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Francis Beckwith. I'm a professor of philosophy here at Baylor, and I'm also co-director with my colleague Trent Doherty of the program in philosophical studies of religion in Baylor's Institute for the Studies of Religion, which is sponsoring this lecture. I'll tell you a little bit about the program that I'm involved in. It's a new venture at ISR. It was founded for the purpose of advancing a better understanding of the nature, scope, and rationality of religious belief by making available to the academy and the general public some of the most important and rigorous philosophical work on religion produced by preeminent scholars across the disciplines. We want to be able to help advance serious conversations about religious belief and its attendant philosophical notions that are often ignored in the wider culture on contested issues of public concern. The question of marriage, including its nature and its role as a public institution in advancing the common good, is just one of those questions. For this reason, we are pleased to have with us this afternoon Sherif Girgis. Born in Cairo, Sherif grew up in Delaware. He majored in philosophy at Princeton, where he won several academic prizes, including the 2007 Dante Prize for the nation's best undergraduate essay on Dante. His senior thesis on sex ethics won the Princeton Prizes for Best Thesis in Ethics and Best Thesis in Philosophy. Upon graduating Phi Beta Kappa and Summa Cum Laude in 2008, he went on to earn a master's degree in moral, political, legal philosophy at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He is now a philosophy PhD student at Princeton and a law student at Yale Law School, where he is an editor of the Yale Law Journal. Apparently he doesn't sleep. Sherif has written on social issues in academic and popular venues, including Public Discourse, National Review, Commonweal, the New York Times, the Yale Law Journal, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and the Wall Street Journal. He is the co-author of the book, What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense, on which he has spoken at more than 50 lectures, conferences, and debates. Please join me in giving a warm Baylor welcome to Sherif Girgis.
I always have to lower the microphone. Thank you so much, Frank, for that kind introduction. Thanks to everybody for coming and to ISR for hosting me. I was saying to a group earlier that I'm a little bit nervous about this because I'm not sure quite what to expect because I'm not used to audiences where there might be anyone who agrees with me. So if you want to make me feel at home, ask challenging questions during Q&A, question my integrity, and we can get going from there. But seriously, I do want to leave a lot of time, maybe an unusually large amount of time for this kind of lecture, for Q&A, because I think despite how warmed over, despite how trodden this area is, it's actually a debate that's unfamiliar to us on intellectual and philosophical terms. And I think Q&A is a really useful context for understanding each other better on what the arguments are. In that vein, I should emphasize what might seem like a strange thing from someone talking about the traditional view of marriage, or what I'll call the conjugal view of marriage, at a Christian university, which is that I'm not going to make a religious argument. Now, I am a Christian, I'm a Catholic, and I do believe the Church's teachings, and I accept Revelation as an authoritative source. So you might wonder why I'm tying my hands behind my back that way. And then the most natural reason people offer or think is that it's just strategic. I'm just trying to sneak in my values under cover of philosophy. But it's not that. First of all, I think, as I was saying earlier to another group, it's probably a toss-up what is more strategically valuable in American politics today, make religious or non-religious arguments. I think there are Christian and theological reasons to care about the non-theological argument on marriage. What do I mean? Well, first of all, Revelation comes to us in very particular and concrete terms in sources like the Scriptures. And it has to be received, it has to be thought out over time. And that process of thinking out is a heavily philosophical process. Okay, Genesis says that marriage is a one-flesh union. What does that mean? Are there pre-Christian or pre-Hebrew or non-Hebrew sources that have a similar concept? How can we unpack it? How can we tell in the real world which kinds of relationships have that, whatever it is, and which don't? That process of unpacking is basically a process of philosophical reasoning. It also helps us apply it to new cases, right? I mean, some ethical questions at least look like they're new ones in terms of technology or new information that we learn about patterns of desires, about the ways that people's inclinations get shaped. And people can reasonably ask, well, is this new information that makes an old norm inapplicable? To figure that out, you've got to know the rationale for the norm. That's a philosophical project. If you're spreading the faith, you will want to show that Christian morality is, as Professor Alex Proust at this university says, an ethics of love. It's not an arbitrary set of rules that God just picked out of a hat. He could pick any other set, and now he's going to make them the test for heaven or hell, for membership in the church or not. It's actually not a divine despotism, but a fruit of divine love. These are the norms that are good for us, for the human good. And the human good is something that St. Paul tells us we can have access to, we can get some sense of, even apart from revelation. In that sense, I think there are good Christian and theological reasons to care about the philosophical case on marriage. If these are both sources of truth, revelation and reasoning of other forms, then after all of it still ultimately comes from God. But it gives us, sheds new light on these goods. The last thing I'll point out is that it also helps us to figure out which Christian norms are important for the life of the church. Which of them matter just for having our own household in order? And which ones are ones that would be good to spread even beyond the church? That's a kind of question that philosophy and philosophical and moral reasoning can shed light on. If as I'm going to argue, marriage is a human good even before it's a sacrament, if the health of the marriage culture has concrete effect on the life and the well-being of real people, flesh and blood, whether or not they identify as Christian, then the case for marriage is going to be something that matters for law and policy in a way that the theological disputes about the Eucharist or about baptism do not. So for all those reasons, I think there's a good case to be made for caring about this case, the philosophical issue. I should say, by way of fairness and disclosure at the beginning, that a lot of my arguments are really just, which are co-authored with Robbie George at Princeton, Ryan Anderson, who's now at Heritage, are really just trying to draw together a lot of other great thinkers' work. And one of the very best of those thinkers alive today is Alex Proust at this university. He's not here, so I can say, without tempting him to pride, that I think he is one of the most gifted philosophers alive today of any persuasion. And that his latest book on sex ethics, One Body, is probably the best thing I've ever read on the issue. And he sent me a draft form of it many years ago, which deeply shaped the very earliest work that Robbie George and Ryan Anderson and I did on this issue. And so I really owe him anything that sounds good in what I'm about to say today. Okay, that's a lot of background. What about my argument? Well, the first thing is it's already, it's not a theological argument, but it's also not an argument from tradition. I think there's a value to that, but at the end of the day, arguments from tradition give us at most caution. They don't tell us what to do once we've waited. It's not an argument from morality in the sense that it's not an argument that assumes anything about the moral status of same-sex sexual acts or sexual relationships. I don't think the only reason to care about the marriage debate is whether you think homosexual relationships are moral or not. There are lots of valuable and morally valuable relationships that don't get recognized as a marriage and that nobody thinks should be. So that can't be the only decisive factor. And the other thing is, it completely preempts the objection from equality. Most people say, we don't even have to have your debate because we know that everybody's equal, so marriage should be available on an equal basis, end of story. Where could we possibly be going wrong in that syllogism? That syllogism assumes everything that needs to be argued. To know whether a particular marriage regime violates equality, to know whether it recognizes some marriages and not others, and so is arbitrary, you have to know what marriage is in the first place and why it matters for policy. Only when you have an answer to those questions can you tell when we're failing to recognize something that is actually a marriage. So before you get to the equality issue, you have to answer this question, and that's why this debate is not familiar to people, because nobody addresses that question. Certainly nobody on the side in favor of recognizing same-sex relationships as marriages. They just take for granted a certain view. My claim, my first claim, is that when you expose that view, when you haul it into the light, you look at it and you think of its implications, you will see that that view gets marriage wrong. And that it gets marriage wrong because it can't explain features of marriage that people on both sides of the debate recognize. So even on their own terms, before religion or social science or anything else, they get marriage wrong. Why is that? Well, think of what that vision of marriage is. You've got two men caring for each other, committed to caring for each other for the long haul. They're sharing the home, all the burdens and benefits of domestic life. Maybe they're even raising a kid together because one of them had one from a previous marriage. If they are brothers, and so only have a platonic relationship, they don't get recognized as a marriage on this new view. If they're unrelated and what brought them together was a sexual relationship, then they do get recognized. So the distinguishing feature of marriage on this new, or what I'll call revisionist view of marriage, is that what really makes a marriage, the thing that makes marriage different, is a certain kind of emotional intensity, or union, or priority. Romantic bond. That's what gets marriage wrong. Why? Well, first of all, people on both sides of the debate tend to agree that to get a marriage off the ground at all, it's the kind of relationship for which you need a permanent commitment. That's part of what makes marriage different. But if all that makes a marriage is a certain kind of emotional union that isn't itself guaranteed to be permanent, that idea doesn't make sense. There's no reason of principle to pledge permanence as opposed to pledging to be together for as long as love, understood as that emotional union, lasts. If marriage is an emotional union, there's no reason of principle, there's no general reason to make it sexually exclusive. Some people, by temperament or taste, sexual exclusivity will foster that emotional bond. But many people increasingly today in mainstream outlets are saying actually that for me and my partner, sexual openness makes the emotional union stronger. And after all, that's what really makes it a marriage. So sexual exclusivity starts to look like a kind of arbitrary imposition if what really makes a marriage is what the revisionist says. The idea that marriage is inherently a relationship of two people starts to look arbitrary. If what makes it is an emotional union, then yes, two men can have that as well as a man and a woman, but so can three men. Three men can have an emotional union and bond, can share all the burdens and benefits of domestic life, can want to avoid stigmatization of their relationship or of children that they rear together. In all of those ways, they make the same argument. So the principle, the view, the distinguishing feature of marriage, emotional union, is something that they can have just as well. So monogamy starts to look arbitrary. But even the idea that marriage is a sexual relationship at all can be questioned on this new view. Why is that? Well, if what makes the marriage is the degree of emotional connection, that's what makes it different, that means that all that sex is contributing to marriage is fostering or enhancing that emotional union. But we know that lots of activities can foster and enhance emotional connection and vulnerability and openness. So if that's all that sex is doing in the relationship, it is replaceable. It doesn't have to be. There's the boundary now between very deep companionship that's platonic and deep companionship that's sexual starts to look arbitrary. So permanence and exclusivity and monogamy and the idea of a sexual relationship, let alone any kind of principled connection to family life or anything like that, all of these things can't be explained on the revisionist view of marriage. They all look just as arbitrary as saying that it's got to be a man and woman. That, in that sense, by the convictions, by the common understandings of both sides of the marriage debate, the new view gets marriage wrong. And this isn't something that just conservatives have said. Increasingly, you see the leaders of the movement to redefine marriage admitting just as much. So, some of my young professors and 300 other LGBT and allied scholars and activists a couple years ago, right at the time, signed something called Beyond Marriage, where they said, of course, sexual complementarity is arbitrary to require, but so is permanence and exclusivity and monogamy and sexual union. So justice, basic requirements of justice, say that you've got to recognize multiple partner and multiple household and deliberately temporary and non-sexual unions. Because what makes a family is love. And all of those kinds of relationships can have that. Dan Savage, in a very sympathetic profile in the New York Times Magazine about 2 years ago, advocated very strongly for making our relationships monogamish, which means basically committed to one person, but with asterisks, where by design and by agreement, the relationship is sexually open. There's been a proposal in Washington Post for wed leases, 2-year or 3-year renewable leases, to make sure, to make sure that you aren't stuck in a sham marriage. To make sure that you're not stuck in a relationship that's just like the two brothers, where where it doesn't have the emotional bond that on this view is what really makes the marriage and what makes it authentic. I can give you a pretty much endless list, and every couple of weeks, if you're in this business, you get an email from somebody who's outraged about the latest news story that just spells out another implication of this new view. So it's something that not only is a kind of logical point that you can see if you consider the implications of this idea of marriage, but it's something that shows that most revisionists who want to draw the line at any two-person bond are actually just as arbitrary as they think the traditionalists are. Their view, by its own lights, is every bit as unjust, imposes every bit as much of an arbitrary restraint on love making a family. So the view starts to, not just fails to account for what marriage is, but actually indicts itself. If that's right, you can also see the implications, or the possible implications, of enshrining this view of marriage in the law, right? Think about why we enshrine any view of marriage in the law at all. It's a very strange thing if you step back. I mean, usually the law is more involved the more public a relationship is, and it's less involved the more personal it is. We regulate business partnerships a lot more than we do best friendships. But marriage is this exception to that general trend. Why is that? Why is it that every culture that has ever survived long enough to leave us a trace of itself has regulated the sexual relationships of a male and a female? When you put it that way, the answer suggests itself. It has a lot to do with the stability of the next generation. And every social good that you could possibly name is connected to that. Right? The health of the next generation, psychologically, physically, coming to emotional and moral maturity, all of that affects every other public good you could name. But all those things, that maturation depends on the stability of the home for children. And in particular, on being reared wherever possible by the man and woman whose love gave them life. That's why the state's basically involved in marriage. So what does its involvement do? It's not just that it makes it easier to pass things down. It's not just economic or property things here and there. Marriage law teaches a vision of marriage. It says and upholds for society an ideal. If marriage comes to enshrine this new view, if marriage law comes to enshrine this new view of marriage that can't explain permanence or exclusivity or monogamy or any of these other norms, those norms would be undermined over time in practice. And to the extent that they were, every one of the public goods that gets the state involved at all would also be undermined. You can think of this by analogy to no-fault divorce. Most people, when no-fault divorce came down, said, or when it was being advocated, said it is just a win-win. If you are in a high-conflict marriage, it'll make it easier to get out. If you're not, what do you care? How will it affect you or your marriage? And 20 and 30 years later, the data are in, and that view was naive. No-fault divorce didn't just change the obstacles to getting married or to getting divorced. It actually made people more likely to consider divorce and therefore more likely to take the option. It undermined the norm of permanence across the board. This change in marriage would double down on the vision of marriage that was behind no-fault divorce. I mean, think about it. What no-fault divorce says is if the emotional union is gone, it's inauthentic to stay in, and you shouldn't have even the slightest obstacle to getting out. This vision of marriage doubles down on the idea that that is what makes a marriage. It reinforces the idea that marriage is primarily about a certain kind of emotional, personal fulfillment of adults. It reinforces the idea that men and women, when it comes to parenting, are perfectly replaceable. You're not contributing anything distinctive to your child's upbringing. Think of the social effects of having a whole generation come of age in a culture where that's what they're being told. Think of a young boy who grows up in a society where those are the messages. How much is he going to be more or less likely to commit to marriage before having children? To stick with the marriage for the sake of the kids when the going gets tough? To stay committed to one person when emotional union and attraction and attachment wanes or wanders? That's the way that marriage affects somebody else. Marriage law shapes what we think marriage is, which in turn shapes people's expectations, and that shapes what people do. And in this realm, that has effects on every aspect of the common good. So you might be with me so far. You might think, all right, I'll grant you that that's the new vision of marriage being offered. It's this whole new substantive vision, mainly distinguished by emotional union. I'll grant you that that can't explain permanence or exclusivity or monogamy or a connection to family life or anything else. I'll even grant you that doubling down on that vision of marriage, formally enshrining it with marriage law, would tend to undermine the stabilizing norms of marriage that get the state involved at all. But what is the alternative? That's a natural question at this stage. What's the other vision of marriage that makes sense of all of these norms put together? Well, in the book, we argue for it as under the title of marriage as a conjugal union, or in some cases, marriage as a comprehensive union. But before I elaborate what that means, I want to point out that it is consistent with the Jewish and Christian understanding of one flesh union, especially as that's been developed over centuries. But not just that. Something remarkably similar to this view of marriage was developed and written about by thinkers who had no connection to Judaism or Christianity. Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and Xenophanes and Ausonius Rufus and Plutarch and the Stoics had amazingly similar views, in some cases even down to the concept of total or integral union in Ausonius Rufus, and to the way that it can only be embodied in the sexual relationship of a man and a woman, and of its special connection to family life and to the public good. In contexts where they could, none of them had ever touched a Hebrew parchment or met a Hebrew prophet. None of them had a Baltimore Catechism sitting on their desk. None of them had a connection to any of this stuff. But also, and just as tellingly, none of them had the concept of a gay identity, which most scholars of any philosophical persuasion tend to agree really came about somewhere in the 19th century. There have always been people having engaging in sexual acts with members of the same sex. But the idea of a separate class of people whose identity is basically distinguished by a stable and exclusive attraction to the same sex is pretty much exclusive to the last 200 years. So these guys couldn't have been motivated by Judaism or Christianity. They also couldn't have been motivated by animus against any particular class. They didn't know about the class. It would be like saying they were motivated by animus against soccer moms. Right? They just didn't have the concept. And yet they had very similar views. It was reflected in the canon law of the church, but also in the common law of England. It was reflected in certain phases of Greek and Roman law. So it's not just a Christian idea, but it is also that. And what is it? Well, again, we say comprehensive union. And by that we mean that in every dimension that makes a form of community at all, the community we call marriage is comprehensive. So what makes community? Well, we think it's cooperation. It's common action. Activity towards common ends in the context of a commitment. And in each of those three ways, the unifying activity, the unifying ends, and the unifying commitment, marriage is comprehensive. So we'll take the first one, unifying activity, right? Most forms of companionship are a union of hearts and minds. You come to know and to seek the other person's good in conversations and other forms of activity and common pursuits. Most people think marriage is a union at all levels with the beloved, a union of heart and mind and body. And most people think that bodily union has something to do with sex. But it can't just be that sex expresses or fosters emotional connection. Because as we've discussed, other activities do that. So there's got to be something else that makes sex specially related to bodily union, which is in turn related to total union. We say you can look by analogy to the union within a person. And here is where we're borrowing very heavily from Alex Bruce and others. What makes the parts of me one body, one flesh, is that they're all actively coordinated together, all my systems and organs, towards a single bodily end of the whole that they make up, which is my biological life. You can explain the role of all my organs, except my spleen or whatever, by reference to my survival. And the remarkable fact about being a human being is that that kind of radical bodily union is possible between two people, but only in one respect. In what our tradition long called the marital act, a man and a woman themselves, like the parts of a single person, are actively coordinated together towards a single bodily end of the whole that they make up together. The bodily end is reproduction, and the whole is the couple. It's the reproduction of them as a unit. So in the conjugal act, you have a coordination towards a single bodily end. And in that sense, a bodily union, and in that sense, possibly a union at all levels, heart, mind, and body. So it's comprehensive in the unifying act that brings the couple together. It's also comprehensive in the range of goods that the relationship is oriented towards. Most particular forms of community are aimed at just particular range of goods. A university community is oriented towards the goods of knowledge and understanding, and that has certain implications. That explains the norms of academic integrity and disclosure and so on that shape a university life. Sports community is oriented towards, I've never been an athlete, but I'm told it's oriented towards athleticism, physical activity, and skillful performance, right? But marriage isn't just oriented to this human good or that human good, but in some sense, all of them. And most people also agree the reason for that is that it's oriented not just to one or another good, but to whole new human beings, new subjects of every good, who, if they come about, have to be developed across that whole range. Well, what explains that? If it were just the choice to raise kids together that explain this connection between marriage and family life, then you wouldn't have to have a sexual relationship. Again, the two brothers in my starting example would have a relationship that unfolds into family life in just the same sense, but we know that they're not married. But the conjugal view explains the connection. On the conjugal view, the very act that makes marital love, that makes the union comprehensive because bodily, is also the kind of act that makes new life. And so marriage itself, the relationship embodied by that act, is fulfilled and enriched by family life and shaped by the norms that family life calls for. So it's comprehensive in the unifying act, in the range of goods that unite the couple. And for those reasons, it's comprehensive in the kind of commitment that it requires. Right? If they're united comprehensively as one flesh in the marital act and in the common life that act brings forth, and the literal one flesh of the children, then it ought to be comprehensive in its commitment. Through time, that means a permanent commitment. And at each time, that means an exclusive one. So this one unifying concept of comprehensive union explains permanence and exclusivity and monogamy and the idea of a sexual union and the connection to family life and through family life to the common good and all the other features that the revisionist view couldn't explain but undermined. So the more we uphold this vision of marriage in law and in culture and in practice, the more we support the stabilizing norms of marriage that serve the public interest. And the more we replace that vision with the revisionist view, the more we undermine those very same norms. The conjugal view of marriage, for that reason, is not just a matter of Christian theology. It's not like saying to baptize, you gotta have running water and the Trinitarian formula. Those rules pertain to a spiritual good, a supernatural good. And in that sense, it makes sense just for the life of the Christian community. We don't want to legislate that beyond because it wouldn't make sense. But this good is a sacrament for a lot of Christian communities, but it's not just a sacrament. It existed in every culture, not just Christian ones, because it serves a human purpose and not just a specifically Christian one. And that is the good of the partners themselves in this particular form of companionship, which is comprehensive, and the good of the children, which is supported when the stabilizing norms of marriage are upheld. If you want to care for the least of these children, one thing you will care about is giving them the best shot at being reared by their own mother and father in a committed bond. It's one of the very best indicators of poverty in adulthood. It's one of the very best indicators of health in physical and psychological and cultural or moral terms. Delinquency and fatherlessness are extremely highly correlated, for boys especially. Every aspect of the common good that might motivate any kind of state action at all, might ever justify having a policy on something, will justify having a strong marriage culture. And a strong marriage culture doesn't happen by accident. That's why every society has had to have social rules to reinforce the idea that men and women stay together and commit to each other as husband and wife to be father and mother to any kids their union might produce. That is a social good, not just a Christian one. Upholding the norms of marriage is, for that reason, a form of social justice and not just a kind of Christian imposition. It's also important to see that on this view of marriage, the idea that a relationship is not recognized as marriage doesn't imply anything about the dignity of the people in that relationship. We have lots of relationships that aren't recognized as marriages, and on this view, that is not because they're less. It's not because they fail to be maximum union in some sense. that they fail to be the highest form of emotional connection. It's simply because they're different. They don't involve comprehensive union. They don't have this principled connection to family life, or through that to the kinds of public goods that justify public regulation. So for all these reasons, you can see this vision of marriage as a social issue that matters beyond the range of the church, as one that we can explain and describe and defend using philosophical and public, as well as specifically religious reasons. And that to the extent that we have any obligations to the least of our brothers and sisters, we have an obligation to fight for the right and stabilizing vision of marriage that gives them the best shot at reaching maturity in the context of the mother and father whose union gave them life. Thanks. So as promised, I left plenty of time. And there's already a question. Yes, sir.
Great, can I stand up?
Yep.
Okay. There are some runners who don't have legs, so they use prosthetic limbs to run. But they use different prosthetic limbs to walk around in normal everyday circumstances. And in this case, there are multiple pairs of things that work together toward a common goal. The goal could be moving around. In one case, the normal fancy legs walk around in a university classroom, and in another instance, a different set of legs paired with the rest of the person is used to run on a field. My question then is, given your view about the comprehensive union that a male and female have to have, how does this prevent different kinds of pairs from also joining together toward that end? The pairs have to be male and female, but suppose a male could have multiple conjugal relationships with females. So how does this prevent something like polygamy, your view?
Okay, good. So how does this explain polygamy if all it really says is that there's a conjugal union? After all, every one of the polygamous marriages involves conjugal unions all over the place. So here are a couple thoughts. First, it's interesting to note that there is actually a distinction here. In pretty much every polygamous culture that we know of, the understanding was not that there are group marriages, that there are some relationships that consist of more than two people that are themselves a marriage, but that there were some men who were allowed to have several marriages. And every one of the marriages was understood as something quite like what I'm talking about, a conjugal union of a man and a woman. When you frame the issue that way, you first of all see a distinction between what's being advocated now, which is genuinely plural marriage, so multiple partners together of whatever distribution of sexes and partners making a single unit that wants recognition as such. But more interestingly, you realize you can see possible motivations for polygamy, which are basically about aristocracy and a certain kind of patriarchy. Right? After all, it is numerically impossible for the majority of men in a culture to be in a polygamous, to practice polygamy, which meant that it was the purview of the elite and of men in particular in almost all of these cultures. So I think that something like the comprehensive view of marriage is accessible by reason, but like any other moral norm, it gets distorted by other kinds of motivations. Now you might still ask, okay, well, how is it though that the comprehensive union explains this? Well, what the conjugal view makes basic to marriage is the one flesh union that unfolds into family life. And it says that the norms of marriage call for a comprehensive commitment. And at any given moment, comprehensiveness means exclusivity, means just one person, means undivided. But those norms are themselves grounded in what's more basic, which is the comprehensiveness of the union in those other two dimensions. And so here, as I think in many areas, you have what's most basic, ethically speaking, being recognized pretty widely And then what's less basic, what is derived from that, being recognized in a more spotty fashion and being distorted by other kinds of motivations, like patriarchy or misogyny, and like a certain kind of elitism. So I think that's what's going on culturally with polygamy. The basic insight is there, but some of its further implications aren't being recognized. And they are further implications because comprehensiveness of union requires totality of commitment. And you don't have that if the commitment is divided. Yes?
So defining marriage in this comprehensive way as a man and a woman who can produce children, raise a family, what does that say about heterosexual couples who are married, who can't have children, never plan to have children because they don't want children, or adopt children and raise children who were not born to them because maybe the birth parents who you said are the best ones to raise them are very young, or maybe they were abusive and they got taken away, the child was taken away from their parents because they were not the best people to raise them. What does that say about the marriage of the heterosexual people who cannot or will not raise children that were born to them through their union?
Good,
Does that
okay.
make them invalid? How can we regulate that? That doesn't.
Right, so how does this view explain childless, or marriages where there isn't natural procreation and children being raised in it? If this view says marriage and family go together, doesn't it mean that a childless marriage or a marriage with children only by adoption isn't real? I think there are two extremes that you can go to on the connection between marriage and family, and I want to reject both of them. So one extreme would be to say there's no principled connection at all. It's sheerly a matter of choice. If you get married, that just means you're committed to this other person, and you might decide to raise kids together, you might decide to get a chocolate lab together, like it's your call, there's no connection. And on the other extreme, you can see marriage as just instrumental to producing a certain result for kids, right? It's just a fancy way of boosting SAT scores, basically. And I think in between is what I'm trying to capture. And in between says, marriage is valuable in itself. Whenever you've got a comprehensive union, you've got something valuable in itself in the way distinctive of a marriage. But that marriage, because of the kind of union it is, would be fulfilled by, is inherently oriented to. It has some kind of lack as the kind of relationship that it is if there aren't children. In other words, there's only a difference of degree between a man and a woman who've committed to each other and so on their wedding night, or a year before the first child comes, or 10 years after the last one goes off to college, or even in the case where they don't have children. They still have the three things. They have a bodily union, because the union is made by coordination towards a single end. Coital intercourse is the first step of that coordination. And for that reason, it's a real bodily union, whether or not the later steps of the process produce a child. And for those reasons, it's a comprehensive union, it's a marriage, it has value in itself, and recognizing it doesn't send us a contrary signal publicly. Doesn't say that a real marriage is just emotional union without any connection to these other aspects of comprehensive union. So let me just finish the thought, and then I'll come back to you for your clarification. So it's a true marriage by the comprehensive union view. It's still a real bodily union because it's still a coordination towards a single end. For that reason, it's still the kind of thing that would be fulfilled by having a kid together, even though it might not have a kid together. So whereas two best friends, that's not true of. And for those two reasons, it's still the kind of thing that calls for comprehensive commitment. And because it's a true marriage in all those ways, recognizing it as one doesn't send the distorting view, doesn't convey a distorted view of marriage that would undermine those marital norms. But you have more to ask. Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, the woman has had a hysterectomy. It's physically impossible for her to conceive a child. Their union, their sexual union, there's nothing in that is directing itself towards a child. That's physically impossible.
how is that? It just seems that the capacity of the couple to conceive a child and raise it as their own seems like just as arbitrary a place to draw the line as any of the other
I see.
things you've mentioned.
So I think that couple still has the root capacity. I mean, you can put it a lot of ways. Take any particular couple, consummates their marriage. There might be reasons of timing that they don't end up conceiving on that occasion. There might be reasons of age. It might be something consumed just a couple days before that threw off the hormonal thing. Okay. I haven't taken biology since 5th grade. It might be, you can imagine all these circumstantial clocks that affect other parts of the process. Some of them might be the fact that other organs that have a role in the same process aren't there. So my point is that it's still the case that any given part of that complex process is a part of the process, is oriented to the single end. In other words, whether two people have coordinated towards reproduction and whether they have, in that sense, had a bodily union, can't depend on what happens hours later, for example, whether the egg meets the sperm. Or it can't happen, or it can't depend on extrinsic factors, like the health of a particular organ on that occasion or in general. So all of these stages are part. You can think of it in another context, right? This is a feature of bodily systems in general, right? My digestive system, every part of that is oriented towards nourishing me. Even if at the very end, the small intestines or whatever don't absorb nutrients, right? This is a general feature of biological systems, which means that in the case of two people, the same thing applies. If the act is part of that complex process oriented towards reproduction, it's a coordination whether or not children come about. Now, at this point, you might have a very different objection. You may say, oh my goodness, we've been splicing and dicing like bodily union and biology and oriented and whatever. I mean, it might just seem, how could this possibly have moral significance, right? How could that matter to what's distinctively valuable about marriage? And I think there are two possible things going on there. One is, some people really think that at the end of the day, your body is just a tool. The real you is your mind or your consciousness or your feelings, your desires. And the body is just an instrument for promoting those. And so at the end, whether the body has a real bodily union or not, doesn't matter. What matters is the body's effect on the mind, on the self. And if you have that view, then it's true. You're not going to care about the details of what makes a bodily union. But I think that view actually is even more counterintuitive if you zoom out. I mean, it fails to explain the idea that bodily union, sexual intercourse should matter at all, as long as there were other ways of promoting desires and connection. It can't explain the idea that there's something distinctively valuable about having your child be bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh, was something that many couples recognize, even if they're very happy to have adopted. It can't explain the idea that grandma is still there and grandma is reversibly comatose. It can't explain a lot of intuitions we have about the value of the body as a real part of the person, such that if marital love seeks total union with the beloved, it also seeks bodily union. So that bodily union and its internal requirements matter morally. That's one thing. And so that's a general idea about who the human being is, who the human person is. And I think there's a lot of rich areas to branch out to see why the view that the body is a part of the person has the better argument. But the other thing that could be happening is that anytime you focus really closely on a particular aspect of a moral issue, because it's the one in dispute, it can start to be hard to remember why it matters at all. Consent. Everybody agrees that consent matters morally in sexual relationships. That's the most consensus view, of all in this debate. But if you really looked at the hard cases in consent, and there are many, your eyes would start to blur across, and just like, why do we care? You'd have to zoom out to remember why it mattered at all. I think the same thing could be happening here. When you have to zoom in on what makes a bodily union, or not this case, but what if it's, you can focus so closely that you forget why it matters at all. It matters because the body is a part of the person. Yeah?
In your book, you talk about a New York Times article where one of the authors mentioned you and your authors as bigots for supporting the conjugal view.
Mm-hmm.
How do you respond, if at all, to those kinds of people that call you a bigot and your co-authors for defending the traditional view of marriage?
Yeah, well, a couple ways. One thing is that it is historically impossible. It's historically impossible that support for the conjugal view of marriage originated in bigotry. It's just impossible. Anybody with any historical depth at all would see that. Why? Again, first of all, because the concept of a gay orientation or lesbian orientation is only about 200 years old, whereas the concept of a conjugal view of marriage is reflected more or less in almost every culture we know of. Two, it's reflected in cultures that have had very favorable attitudes towards same-sex sexual conduct, just considered as such. So even if you made what I think is the mistake of equating a moral disapproval of an act with bigotry towards a person, you would have to think that there was some other explanation for this view besides bigotry. Another thing is that this view draws distinctions within opposite-sex relationships. It's not just that if you have attractions to the same sex that you wouldn't be interested in the kind of relationship that this view calls a marriage. There are all kinds of impediments, and in fact, in the vast majority of the literature, in philosophical or canonical or legal, what people were concerned about was figuring out what made a man and woman who had had a wedding ceremony truly married or consummated in their marriage. There's no way that lines within that category were motivated by animus against gay people. And the other thing I would point out is that any vision of marriage is going to draw a line down the world into two, between what counts as a marriage and what doesn't. The fact that it draws a line can't be a problem. The question is where the line should be drawn. And my argument is that it's the proponents of same-sex marriage who draw the line in arbitrary ways. But in that sense, are unjust. I wouldn't say bigots, but if that's the language they want to use. But there's a second thing, which is that it's actually because they're assuming their own view of marriage that they think that to call something not a marriage is denigrating. Why? I hinted at this earlier. If you think what makes a marriage it's a matter of degree, it's just the most of what makes any connection valuable, then for you to say that something's not a marriage is to say that it's less. But if you have a different view of marriage, where it's defined by a particular kind of cooperation and common good, then to not be in a marriage is not to have something less, but something different, which can, in other forms of companionship, can have their own distinctive value and forms of presence and care and so on. So I would say partly they're importing their own assumptions so that they think you're just saying they're less, or you're saying the only reason not to include them is that it's a problem with the persons, as opposed to a genuine difference in the relationship. Yes?
In regards to a couple that choose in vitro fertilization, where the orientation of that relationship is towards the fostering of a new generation, but the coital act is absent, would that relationship still be, or should it be regulated by the government as a public good issue?
Good. So I don't think they would have a marriage on this view of it. I don't think they would have the bodily union or blah, blah, blah. Okay, but I do think, I mean, there's still a child there.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, the question was, what about a couple that has children by in vitro fertilization? What should be the legal regime with respect to them? And I'm saying they're not a marriage, and for the sake of the public good, if you're going to recognize marriage at all, you don't want to send distorted views of it, fine. But there's still the case that there's a child there who has basic needs. Now here's what I think about that case and about other arrangements where you have a non-marital relationship, but you have grown-ups in a household with kids. There may well be particular kinds of legal accommodation that we need to make for them. Maybe if we have a tax break for education for married couples, there is a reason at least to have it for any household. It might be counteracted by the bad incentives that send, whatever, okay. But there is a reason. But the reason will be no weaker if the relationship isn't sexual. So people who propose, well, I mean, how could you possibly deprive these households with kids of these practical, basic benefits? I would say, on your view, they are deprived of them if their parents happen not to be having sex, which is a very strange view indeed. So if there are basic needs that need to be met outside of the connection to marriage in particular, they should be met wherever they arise. If living together creates them, then they should be met where living together creates them, whether it's 2 brothers or 3 sisters or whatever it is. Yeah.
You want to say that?
Please?
Okay. I vocalize easier now.
Yep.
So it seems like, can we agree that the crux of your argument is, or at least one of many, would be that you claim that heterosexual marriages raise children in a way that would be more beneficial toward the children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then how do you account for what I would consider, and what many would consider to be the most comprehensive study, which was done by the American Academy of Pediatrics, which went over 30 years, and again, is by far the most comprehensive study, which concluded that there was no discernible difference between children who were raised by homosexual relationships as compared to those who were raised by heterosexual relationships.
Good. Okay, so what about these studies, or that one in particular? There are many that are cited. So there are something like, I think, 55 studies cited by the APA saying no difference. No difference. Doesn't that just devastate the whole view, right? A couple of things about that. There's a review of the literature by Dr. Lauren Marks in Social Science Research, which is a peer-reviewed social science journal as good as any, in which he points out that I think all of them but one, which just studied, I think, graduation from primary school, so the rates of retention versus failing in primary school, were deeply methodologically flawed in very concrete ways. Not just that they didn't meet this like completely unrealistic ideal, but that they involved snowball sampling, where you basically put up a poster somewhere, have friends invite their friends, where you ask the parents to rate the outcomes as opposed to ask the parents to rate themselves as parents, as opposed to asking the children when they've grown up to give indicators about how they've been, where there aren't large samples and where there aren't random samples. Now, this is partly a difficulty of the field itself. I mean, the number of households led by a same-sex couple, much less a same-sex couple, I mean, a same-sex pairing, much less one in a sexual relationship, is very low, so it's hard to get the big numbers. We have 2 studies that do try to do that. One by Dr. Mark Rigneris, also in social science research in the same issue. And another by Doug Allen using Canadian census data, because the Canadian census asks questions about this stuff that ours doesn't yet. And those reflect a pattern that we've seen every time we've studied married biological parenting against any alternative, which is that married biological tends to do best, overall on the longer haul. Now, it would be very surprising. Those studies tend to reflect two things. One is that on the whole, a biological connection matters, and one is that men and women seem to affect children in different ways. Both of those things, plus the general pattern so far, would make it very surprising if we had repeated and repeatable experiments that meet this methodological standard that showed a difference. That there would just be, just in this case, the deviation from married biological does better, or does as well. But here's the second thing. It's not just about indicators like levels of depression or suicide or graduation or whatever. I think, and not just I, but philosophers who have no particular Christian or conservative dog in this fight are very happy to say that, and to argue, that biological connection itself makes a difference. It is itself of some value. It's not absolute. It's defeasible when there are particular problems with a couple that make them incapable of caring for the child, but that it has a distinctive value. And you can cash that out in lots of ways. If we're really bodily persons, then maybe bodily union of that kind, it has distinctive moral value. Maybe it's that David Velleman at NYU, hardly Christian conservative, argues that actually it helps in basic identity formation to have that kind of systematic and long-term connection to your biological heritage. You can think of it in just very simple thought experiment terms. And if it didn't have value, then we wouldn't be wronging any child if at the maternity ward we just shuffled the kids randomly and distributed them to anyone, right? We wouldn't be hurting a child in any way. And it's also reflected in studies of children created by in vitro anonymous sperm donation. My Daddy's Name is Donor is one that reflects that even apart from other empirical effects, there is just a felt loss in not being connected to your biological parents when that has distinctive value. So in all these ways, I think the social science, the general patterns on the social science are, when reliable, pointing in the other direction. Even apart from the kinds of things that the social science studies, there's a distinctive value in biological connection. But if it turned out that actually, after all, it didn't matter, if it was just about having income flowing into the house and having adults around to provide an example and a role model and so on, then I would just advocate getting the state out of the marriage business entirely. There'd be no reason to prefer some adult pairings over others at all. But that's not reflected on either side of the current marriage debate. Yep, follow up.
That's a follow-up question. So while all of that sounded like a really good argument against against giving kids up for adoption, I'm not entirely sure how that really works as an argument against letting gay people adopt, or letting anybody really adopt, or setting any standards as to who adopts. Again, having all the studies show that it really doesn't matter who raises it, just if it's men or a man and a man or a man and a woman. It doesn't seem like any real argument against letting these people raise it if they've already been separated from their original parents because they've been put up for adoption. The gay people aren't aren't really making that happen more often. It just happens to be where they're going.
Yeah, so that's a common question. Well, what's the link? So what? Let's grant everything you said. The point is not that recognizing same-sex relationships means that gay people are going to kidnap a kid from a straight couple. Or that's the way it's caricatured as a way of saying, what could the causal link here be? But it's something like this. Recognizing relationships as a marriage upholds a particular ideal, a particular norm for everybody across society. And that shapes what people do across the board, not just the same-sex couple. It shapes the motivations and the incentives and the pressures on a man who's in a relationship where he's just not feeling the emotional connection anymore, but he's got kids and he wants to figure out, well, what does it make a difference? If it turns out that men and women make no special impact, that there's nothing distinctive about one or the other, that men are perfectly optional, then his motivations to stick with it are lower. Now, so that's the kind of systematic effect that's distinctive of a social institution. The whole point of making it an institution as opposed to a case-by-case thing, the whole point of having marriage law as opposed to just private contracts, is that it upholds a norm that affects everybody. So it's not the fact that this household will then have you. Now, having said that, I do think it's unrealistic to expect that recognizing marriage between members of the same sex would not eventually lead to either more people, in fact, creating children by in vitro fertilization for these households, or even a sense of the need to provide public support for people to do so. This is something that has been advocated by folks in favor of same-sex marriage, because, after all, nature provides a very big roadblock to people in these relationships having something that looks like an opposite-sex couple. And so it can be very easy to see that if part of the role of the state is to make these as similar and as equal in that sense as possible, that there would be a need for public support, and certainly for not discouraging it. But I think we should discourage deliberate depriving of a kid of their own parents, whether it's by same or opposite sex. Yes, sir.
Okay, just kind of building on what you just said, where do you think this all leads? For example, California allows same-sex marriage, Texas doesn't. Personally, my opinion is it ultimately leads to chaos at some point in the future. Maybe not tomorrow or the next day, but decades in the future. And secondly, how do you get the state out of marriage? And, I'll recognize that marriage, but I don't recognize that marriage, so I'm not going to make a cake for that wedding. It gets sued, so to speak. So how do you get the state out, and where does this all lead to in the future?
Well, I think we're quickly approaching a kind of equilibrium among the states, where unless it's a judge that does it, probably there won't be too many switches on either side of the aisle for a long time. Now, the reason I say unless a judge that does it is obvious, and if that happens, then I think there's, like on the life issue, there's very little that citizens can do except a very long-term investment in building the political and legal and cultural capital to get those kinds of things reversed. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. In fact, the only reason that my generation is more pro-life than my parents' generation is that we have done it on the life issue. And we can continue to do it on this and on other issues. So I think that's basically where this goes next. We will reach an equilibrium among the states, which will look something like what it is now. And unless we get a Roe v. Wade on marriage, the thing to do will be the long-term game for restoring, not just on this particular issue, but with respect to permanence and no-fault divorce, with respect to cohabitation and lack of commitment before marriage, all of these things, fighting for the vision of marriage as conjugal union, comprehensive union that we think is best, and hoping that over time the cultural changes are enough to begin restoring the legal as well. And if I agree with you that if the other section of DOMA gets struck down, the one that allows states not to recognize same-sex relationships conducted in other states, we'd have an effective Roe on marriage, because it would be very hard for a state to sustain a split marriage law within its borders, and hard for the courts to let them do that.
Well, join me in thanking Sherif Girgis.